Look, I think strike rate's very, very overrated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strike Rate, the cricket analytics podcast with me, Jack Hope, and Dan Weston. This week on the podcast, we're going to be talking about drafts and auctions. What's the difference between the two? How do you prepare for one? And how does analysis feed into that? Just a reminder that we want you to enjoy the show, first of all, and support the show, second of all, by liking and subscribing, following on whatever platform you found the podcast. This is our third episode. We've got plans for many more. We want your engagement, so make sure you leave a comment and all of that, and follow us on Twitter. I'm at JackHope0, and you can find Dan at SA Advantage. Dan, how are you doing, first of all?
Yeah, good. We're recording this on Sunday. We just watched England get absolutely decimated today by India in the Test match on day 4. So it was, actually quite funny.
Yeah, it was, gallows humour or hilarious if you're not English, I think, and very sad, very rage-inducing for some people. Before we get into auctions, Dan, we wanted to touch upon something else first, didn't we? So we're going to take a mini diversion into the world of Basra, thanks to a little bit of buzz that was on Twitter this week after Australian cricket broadcaster Neroli Meadows inadvertently caused a minor storm by not only tweeting about Basra but also doing producing a table which combined T20 Basra with ODI Basra, making the whole measurement sort of twice as useless. If you don't know what Basra is, it's an acronym for batting average, strike rate added, or some version of that. So effectively you take a batter's strike rate and their average and you add it together, and what that's supposed to give you a picture of is the overall production of a batter in white ball cricket. You'll occasionally see it come up on broadcasts and someone will say, look at this guy, he's got the highest Basra in the IPL, and you're supposed to be impressed by that. However, Dan, it's not necessarily all it's cracked up to be, is it?
No, and it's definitely not to be confused with the Iraqi city that someone tweeted me about as well. Look, it's quite a flawed metric because of several factors. First of all, and this is actually an area that I'm working on quite intensively at the moment with one of my teams that I work for, is that what I'm looking at is like the correlation between different metrics and success and failure. And actually, these two metrics aren't very well correlated. In fact, they're kind of reverse correlated, but also intertwined, if that makes sense. So a strike rate will change someone's average because obviously, if you're striking at a high rate, then you're scoring more runs per ball, which can lead to a higher average. However, the problem is that the trade-off also exists that the more aggressive you bat, the less likely you are to lose, which then reduces the average. So it's kind of like this weird intertwinement, but also just completely unrelated things. Second of all, as well, is that you're comparing a number which is typically, for T20 at least, under 30, with the number in T20 at least is typically over 130. So, like, for example, let's say you've got a batter who averages 30 at strike rate 130. So their batter is going to be like 160. Well, what happens if you've got a tail ender who averages 10 but strikes at 200, like a Rashid Khan kind of player? that makes him a better player. And like, do you know what I mean? Like, Basra is going to love someone like that. So it has massive limitations. So what I prefer, instead of if you are obsessed with these two metrics, which I don't think are the be all and end all by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, if a team was to solely use these two metrics as a guide for recruiting players, I think that'd be awful. If you're going to do it, look at it from like a mean, that's what I'm trying to think of, like how much difference to the mean deviation that they are from each one to the other. So, for example, 143 strike rate, if the mean is 130, would be 10% above the mean. That would be a much fairer way of doing it rather than comparing two numbers which are like miles different to each other. I think someone on Twitter compared it to assessing the quality of a car by adding its mileage to its miles per gallon figure or something like that. Like, and it is like really that absurd. I even saw someone like talk about like dividing the whole total by cupcakes and things like that, which is pretty crazy as well. I mean, it shows you how the irrelevance of it really is.
Yeah, I think to some extent the cream will rise to the top in that, because obviously if you do have in Basra, I mean, because obviously if you do have a really good strike rate, you'll ultimately have a really good Basra as well. But the point you make about these being two entirely separate measures, measuring entirely different things and giving you entirely different information about a player, mean that if you ever do see Basra, your first instinct is probably going to be, well, I wonder how that breaks down into average and strike rate, which is the actual information that would be valuable in that scenario. So I think it's one to treat with a little bit of caution. At best, it's going to be sort of an interesting. At best, it's going to be something interesting to note, but I don't think you'd ever want to be picking a player or not picking a player based on Basra because of that. Well,
I think
because it's not actually. Yeah, because it's a valueless proposition, basically. Well, I will say though, obviously this got tweeted up, and it was quite a funny tweet as well, because it had the Basra from T20 added to the Basra from ODI, which are entirely separate formats and have different drivers of success to some extent as well. So it made the whole thing even more meaningless. But what I will say is that it was good to see somebody from mainstream cricket broadcasting at least talking about something analytical, even if what they were talking about was effectively mumbo jumbo. Like it's the first step to people understanding more about the game is to ask questions and put ideas out there. And if those ideas are wrong, so be it. We've all had bad ideas, and
for sure.
I'm sure we will in the future. So don't crush people's dreams.
But the thing is the vast majority of these commentators will have at some point been offered services by people like me who could have helped them in this area, like in the last 5 years. So realistically, there's no excuse for anyone to be basic at understanding data because the services are out there.
Yeah,
and I also I tweeted about this at the time. I also think that people who are commentating who are using such kind of flawed methodologies is actually quite a big kick in the teeth for the people out there who are doing much better work than that and not getting any recognition whatsoever.
Yeah, I think it's a journey though. Like these things filter in. So that I'm going to take the more optimistic take, and you can take the hardcore analytical one. Dan, I said we're going to get into auctions, and we're going to do that. So we're covering it's quite it's auctions and drafts. So we're going for a big topic area here.
Yeah.
I suppose this episode, when we're talking about preparation for one, from largely from your perspective, I suppose one of the key things to talk about here is the difference between an auction and a draft. So do you want to kick us off with a really brief summary of the two and what the differences are?
Yeah. So throughout this discussion over these next episodes, I want to kind of make one basic assumption to start with, and that is that every team has a level budget and that they're willing to spend all of that level budget, because it just makes life so much easier to make that assumption. And 99% of the time it's true as well. You might get the odd team who just don't want to spend anything at the auction, but it doesn't happen very often. Okay, so differences between the two. Well, the primary difference is that at an auction, the free market determines how much that player will sell for, or effectively their market value at that stage, on that day, at that time. And so it's a purer way of identifying player valuation than a draft, where you have to pick a player in a certain salary bracket and you don't get to negotiate that price. The second thing as well is that in an auction, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this, but it's undisputable, that's a fact, is that if you want to buy a certain player, 100% you can. You just make sure you've got more money than everyone else and you're willing to do that. If you want an individual in your squad, you can get him. However, in the draft, unless you've got first pick in the first round, which obviously most of the time is you're fighting with 6 or 8 other teams to have that luxury, you can't guarantee that. So you can't look at players in a draft as much as like a must-have, if that makes sense. And I don't really value the concept of must-haves probably as much as a lot of other people. I'd much rather use depth charts and things like that. But effectively, that's a huge difference straight away. So, for example, and drafts can take a few different courses in terms of how they're structured. So, in a 100 draft, for example, it's done as a snake, and anyone who is interested can Google snake draft to understand a bit more about that. I think it's used in like American fantasy sports quite a lot and things like that as well. So if you're first pick in round 1, your last pick in round 2, first pick, and then first pick again in round 3, that type of thing. So it goes in like a kind of snake structure. In the PSL, which is a model that I much prefer in terms of draft structure, the rounds are drawn in advance at random. I think a couple of weeks before, in advance of the draft, so you know which pick you're going to have in each round. And it could be like, round 1, you might get lucky and have pick 1, and the same in round 2. But then in round 3, 4, 5, you might have pick 6 or something like that. Like that. It could be anything. You don't know where you're going to be until this pre-draft draw is performed. And I think that I prefer that because it's a bit less predictable and it can be quite random in structure. And I think it's got more in it in terms of those people who want to think outside the box.
Yeah, so I'll follow up to that then, because there are, we've got auctions, we've got drafts, but there's another level to this as well. We've got mega auctions and mega drafts in a sense, and mini auctions and mini drafts. So think about the IPL here for people that maybe don't follow it that closely. I assume most of the listeners will, but just to explain it, every few years there's a new auction cycle, and pretty much all the players get thrown into a big pot, and teams more or less start from scratch. But in the intermediary years, so each year between those two mega auctions, there will be the chance for players to cut and add, chance for teams rather to cut and add players to sort of refresh their squads on an annual basis. Really quickly to end part 1, Dan, can you explain the dynamics and the differences between those mega drafts and mega auctions and the mini versions of them that happen each year?
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to kind of participate in a few different types of those auctions. So hopefully I can give some interesting insight to listeners and viewers about that type of thing. So first of all, mega auction in the IPL 2022, the teams were allowed to retain no more than 4 players from their existing roster. And they needed to, if they wanted to retain 4, they could recruit another 21 at auction to make their squad of 25, maximum of 21 to make the maximum squad of 25. At Punjab, we actually only retained 2 players. So we had a little bit more shopping to do in the mega auction and a slightly bigger budget to throw around as a result. Now, effectively at this point, you're not far off starting from scratch, right? We had 1 pacer and one batter. That was it. And that's a you can really go from the ground up again in terms of working out an identity for a squad. How you're not, basically, the best thing about it is you're not dealing with the mistakes that other people have made. So usually when you've gone into a team in, say, a mini auction environment, say like you're brand new as a head coach or head of recruitment or something like that, you can't make wholesale changes very quickly. You've got to deal with the players that the other coach has already picked, kind of thing, or the other regime has picked. So you might have to make sort of small changes rather than big ones until the mega auction comes about. So I always think it's harsh in the IPL environment to judge a coach until they've had a mega auction to recruit players, basically, or if they're a big part of the recruitment. So mega auction, we're going from scratch. We can build an identity very, very quickly. So what I tried to do in the work that I did with Punjab, we had an identity where I think all of us in the sort of auction group were very aligned to, which was we wanted to play very attacking cricket and entertain entertain the fans, but also play a winning style, and that all kind of correlated into the squad that we picked. Whether teams generally look to recruit certain players based on identity is certainly a moot point. I think teams could do a lot more to do that. And then you go into a different environment, which will be the mini auction. And because you can only make small changes to your squad, there's a completely different dynamic. So in a mega auction, you might find it's quite, because you've got to buy 23 players or 20 plus players. You've got to make sure that your money goes a long way and you can't bust your budget too quickly. Whereas in a mini auction, you might only be looking at 2 or 3 players, and you might have 30 crore to spend or something like that. So you can actually overpay for a skill set that you particularly want. And there will be a skill set. So, for example, a genuine all-rounder or a world-class pacer who bowls power play and death or something like that. Or those type of players, they're going to get, if there's only a few of them in the auction hall, or even less, maybe like 1 or 2, and 5 teams want them, the bidding's going to go crazy in that mini auction environment, which is why you see players get stupid bids like what we saw in the IPL for like Mitchell Stark and Pat Cummins. The teams just knew that there was no other real alternatives for them in that situation. So they just went, right, well, we're going to have him no matter what, until they basically run out. And to some extent, that's the same dynamic in a mini draft as well. You might identify like a gap in your squad that so for example, 100, right? You can retain no more than 10 players. So you've got the crux of your squad assembled before you enter the draft room. Obviously, I think there's been times where like a couple of teams have retained far less than 10, but on the whole, that's generally what happens. If you've got a kind of half decently constructed squad, you're often retaining sort of 8 to 10 players minimum. And from there, you're looking to fill specific gaps in your squad. You're not looking to say, okay, well, he's a good player, we'll have him. You're looking to say, I want this player who can play this role because that's what we don't have. And so therefore, you might have to pay, like, say, top bracket for someone because like they're literally the only player in the draft list who offers all of the things that you need in one package. Doesn't mean necessarily that you value them as the best player in a draft, but they become as kind of, I don't really like the term must have, but they become kind of mandatory because of the fact that they're only that type of skill set. So I'll give you an example. You might want a left-handed wicketkeeper who can bat in various places, and there's not many of them, and so therefore you have to go all out and get that player before someone else does. Otherwise, then you might say that, okay, well, the balance and the structure of your squad is kind of taking a downturn if you don't get that player. So again, there's that overvaluation of players in the short term in a very competitive mini environment that perhaps you don't get in the mega environment, even in a draft, because basically in a mega environment, but it's draft or auction, you get much closer to the truer market value of a player, whereas supply and demand dynamics dictate so much in a mini auction or draft.
Great, Dan. I think that's perfect to wrap up part 1 there. When we come back, we'll be talking about how to prepare for an auction, what strategy is, and a few other dynamics. The local v overseas thing that comes up a lot, so we'll interrogate that in some more detail. We should say as well, in part 3 of the episode, we'll be talking about, we'll be fielding questions from listeners as sourced through Twitter, so do stick around for that. And if you want to ask a question on a future show, like I said at the beginning of the episode, seek us out on Twitter, seek out Dan on Twitter at SA Advantage, and keep an eye out for when he posts about new episodes. We'll be back in a moment. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strike Rate, the cricket podcast with me, Jack Hope, and Dan Western. We're talking auctions today and how to prepare for one. So, Dan, it's a really simple question, but I'm sure it'll be quite a complicated answer. How do you prepare for an auction or a draft?
Well, I know we've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to try and make it a little bit more sort of time efficient if I can. Okay, so just to give you some context about maybe like what I would have done ahead of the IPL auction, it might be, I would say, probably a good 6 weeks of work, if not longer. Very intensive, pretty much full-time work that you're doing probably by this point. You don't have the auction list by that point, or the draft list if it's a draft tournament. So you're working on the assumption that players will enter the room for the bidding, basically, or you'll be available for the tournament, and you're going to create, or I did anyway, create a very long list of players. Now, then you might get the actual list, closer in the process, and you can kind of add or prune certain players. I think the first point for me is to source data on every single player that I can, and so I did that. I also built a model which had predictive capabilities. So I used a lot of historical data to provide transferability data from different leagues to the other. So, for example, I would know how the average batter from, say, the Tamil Nadu Premier League would perform in the IPL. And I knew what level they would have to perform at in that league to be like an average player in the IPL, basically. And I could do that for any league in the world, whether it's in India or overseas. So then I built a model, and I had expected data for every player in the auction list. You're splitting players into different skill sets, and they might not be broad skill sets. They're not going to be broad skill sets. So when I say a broad skill set, I'm talking about batter, bowler, all-rounder. They're going to be much more niche than that. So it'd be like, I don't know, middle order spin hitter, or anchor opener, or whatever it might be. You know that there's a lot more nuance than just batter, bowler, all rounder. You're going to make notes on whether they're left-handed or right-handed, what type of spin they bowl, what type of pace they bowl, what phases that they bowl. They'll be split into different depth charts, basically, based on all of that. Then you're doing a lot of due diligence on the player, understanding their personality, character. Now, when I was in hospital, I spent a lot of time learning how football teams look at this type of thing and their recruitment, character, and the personality of players. And there's some really, really interesting insight that you can get from the industry of football. So, like, you might have a football team might pay someone to go through 10 years of a player's Twitter posts or Instagram posts to see if they're like a good person or not, basically. You know what I mean? Like, that's the stuff you can do. If you're driven enough to do that, you can do that. But actually, as it goes, most of the time, I say now that I can probably make like 1 or 2 phone calls and send a couple of WhatsApps or something, and I can find out pretty much anything about. Well, I can find out about pretty much any player because I know someone who knows them. So you can get those kind of character references pretty easily. And so from the depth charts, you're going to look at doing sample 11s, modelling opposition 11s. What are the opposition likely to source in the auction based on their current retentions, their historical trends, what the coach likes, the emotion that they might bring into the auction environment, that type of thing. So I'll give you a good example, right? Before 2022 mega auction, it became very obvious in the planning process that if Mumbai bought Ish and Kishan, they basically would have no money to spend on bowlers, which is exactly how that played out. And I mean, I thought they'd probably go for a little bit more, but the Kishan would go for a little bit more. But I knew that if they spent ballpark 12, 13 crore or more for him, that would be a big problem for them constructing a bowling lineup and have implications later on in the auction. The other thing as well is the mock auction strategies and how that works. I mean, this is the first mock auctions that I did, but I ended up kind of being extremely involved in the running process of them. And it was fascinating. They take a long time, but they're probably the best, most kind of demanding but fun part of the auction preparation process. And we're trying to see what decisions become influenced by a different decision, if that makes sense. So, using the Kishan example, Mumbai by Ish and Kishan, what happens to their bowling attack after that? Can you recruit a competent bowling attack? If, I don't know, RCB pay 16 crore for Cameron Green, what does that imply for their bowling attack this year, for example? Like those type of conversations are really, really useful in terms of that mock auction planning, and also to get a handle on player valuation. So we did some pretty cool work. I can't really talk about it much because I want to use it again, but we did some pretty cool work on player valuations based on a lot of mock auctions, and we were really pleased with how that worked out in terms of the closeness of the predicted value actually was to the expected value. So eventually, from all of those processes, you're going to work out like a kind of a pecking order of players you want for each type of niche skill set, and you're going to have a rough idea of what they might cost, and you're going to have so that effectively their market value. Now, your market value for them might be different to the market value. So if you really need a player, for example, and you think that the market value of say 6 crore for that player, you might want to have to go to 8 or 9 because he's a really important cog in your squad. So your value is different to the market value, but ultimately it gives you a really good handle on how much you should be bidding for a player and whether someone becomes overpriced or underpriced based on the bidding from other teams. So I found personally that having that information to hand in an auction environment was so useful because you would be able to get a much better grasp on whether people are bidding emotionally to prevent yourselves from bidding emotionally. And you could almost like say to people who, whoever's holding the paddle, you could say, go no higher than this for player X, and then we'll reassess when we get to that point. And that happens a lot. So for me, that's a good way of dealing with it. But as you can see, there's a lot of different facets in this preparation for certainly a mega auction. And go for it, Jack.
Yeah, and that's I think we'll get into the dynamics of the in-auction process probably in the second part or the next episode 4. To round off this segment before we get to listeners' questions, I've got a few kind of quicker points to touch upon. One that you hear all the time in analysis of auctions and drafts is this local v overseas dynamics point. The classic example is someone in England getting really upset that Adil Rashid didn't get picked up in the IPL auction. Can you explain that and how you factor that into your process?
Okay, so my general view, it's not always hold of us rule, but generally I would say that my perception of team building is that if you're looking at it as a cake, the overseas players are like the icing, but you can't get anywhere without the base of good local players. And when I say local, I just mean domestic. I don't mean they have to come from that area or anything like that. So yeah, it's really, really important to have a good domestic core to start with. And you might have to overpay for domestic players compared to overseas players because of the scarcity of resources. So for example, a high intent top order batter is quite a scarce resource in the Indian market, which is why Manish Pandey has got like loads of bids, even though he's not really that high intent player at all, because they don't really have that many players who can bat at the top of the order who are established, right? He's had as many clubs as Tiger Woods almost, but it's because there's a scarcity of resource of a particular skill set. Whereas like there's loads of good overseas openers who just never get picked, or they get like 1 crore or something like that because there's tons of them. So it's about scarcity of resources, and it's that has a major influence on pricing. So going back to what you were saying about Adil Rashid, and I think it was Michael Vaughan who really kicked off a couple of years back on this point in the most notable way, is that IPL teams perceive that their local spinners, or so domestic spinners, can do as good or similar job to overseas spinners, or a capable job, and not use an overseas slot. Because you can only pick 4 overseas in your starting 11, you've got to really use those players in areas where perhaps the local pool isn't as strong, and they perceive that other skill sets are more viable for those overseas player slots than a leg spinner or just a spinner.
Great. Another quick one. How do you identify a bargain? You've talked a little bit about market forces and so on, or market values and so on. But I think this is something that people really want to know. Like, do you, as part of your preparation, do you have an idea of of who you might be able to swoop in and pick up either in a late round in a draft or for little money in an auction? Or is this more of a reflexive thing that we'll cover in the next episode?
I think in a draft it's tricky because you're always concerned that someone's going to pick a player up in an earlier round. I can remember, so for example, like Ryan Ahmed got picked up, I think, at 50k by Simon Brave when he got first picked in 100 draft. And my perception of that selection was that they didn't want him to get to a lower price point at that stage. I mean, Ray had probably only played, I think, either a very small amount or no T20 by that point. So they were really just wanted to make sure that they took that pick off the table for everybody else, and would gamble that he would develop, which obviously he has. In terms of identifying a potential bargain, I do a lot of work. I can't go into that much detail with it, but I do a lot of work on age curve analysis. And so, look, there's certain things you can do to work out whether a player has a high expectation of being good when they reach peak age. So, one player ahead of the mega auction that I did that I was convinced would be a really, really good player was Tilak Varma, but ultimately the cards didn't fall for us in that situation, and he went to Mumbai. But all the analysis that I did in terms of age curve analysis said that he was going to be like a superstar, and within 2 years now he's still young and he's playing for India, so he's on course for that, right? So yeah, I mean, I would use a lot of data for this in terms of identifying potential bargain. I still think we got a lot of good bargains when I did do the IPL. For example, Jitesh Sharma was 20 lakh and now he's playing for India, and there's not many players you can say that about. So yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into that, but ultimately a player is only a bargain if no one else can understand their value too.
Final question then, Dan.
There's two people want the same player, that's when the bidding goes crazy, right?
Yeah, for sure. Final question then, Dan, before we move on to stuff that we've got through from listeners. Prior to an auction, to what extent do ownership or team management get involved in this process, or in your experience, or?
It depends, I'll be honest. I felt that when I was doing the IPL, for example, the management were extremely supportive, and the ownership was extremely supportive. Especially if you're able to talk eloquently about why a certain player was valuable, what skill sets they offered, and why they were a good option based on their skill sets. I felt that you would get backed. But I'm not necessarily sure that's always the case with a lot of teams. I'm certain it's not the case with a lot of teams. I know that owners do get way more involved than they should, which to me makes no sense, because as an owner, you're effectively appointing people to do the jobs that they're experts in. You should be delegating them that responsibility. Owners in football have made decisions in the past. It's hardly ever ended up well. So use that as a benchmark, basically. And, if you're an owner of a football team or cricket team, you've probably got a lot of money, fair to say. And if you've probably got a lot of money, you've either inherited it and been really, really lucky, or you've earned it in business, right? So if you earn a lot of money in business, you should understand already that you have to employ experts to do the day-to-day running of your business. You don't get like whoever owns Sainsbury's going, oh, okay, well, actually, no, I want to buy this type of frozen food today, because in terms of stock, there's someone else who does that for them. So why don't he have that? Why do owners want to be so hands-on in cricket? For me, I think the answer is that they look at it as a hobby as opposed to an actual viable business. On some occasions.
Great, Dan. I think that wraps up part 2. We will take a really short break and be back with your questions in part 3. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strike Rate part 3 of our show on how to prepare for a draft or auction. It's time for your questions. Before we get to that, just a quick thanks to Tanelli, Darshan, Razi, Callan, and Joe, who all asked questions that I'd already put down on the list of questions for this show. So we won't get to yours, but we did see them and we appreciate the interaction. First question, Dan, is from another Dan Good on Twitter. Do you or any other analysts keep any sort of data on situational characteristics of a player? For example, Ben Stokes, his stats aren't exceptional, but he's a mega clutch player and turns up when the team needs it.
I don't really believe in the word clutch in terms of cricket players for several reasons. Is that to be a professional sports player, already you're going to have to be quite strong mentally compared to the average person. It's almost like a filter out process already. But more importantly, how many times in a player's career are they in like a mega clutch situation? Now, everyone says this about Ben Stokes, which obviously Dan's referred to in his question here, but they don't remember the name Carlos Brathwaite World Cup.
Ben Stokes remembers the name.
I'm sure he probably does. And so they don't refer to that. They don't refer to the fact that his team needed him today in the test match and he got out straight away. You know, like it's almost like a fallacy in people's heads that they remember the times that a player bailed out a team, like Stokes did in Headingley, for example, but they don't remember the times when it was just, you know, a mundane event like today when he got out like everyone else did for barely any runs. And I think that you can throw a Sam Curran into that, because the commentators in England, they always say Sam Curran makes things happen. But he doesn't, because there's games he goes 0 for 40 and gets out quickly. But they just forget about those. So for me, no, I'm not a massive fan of this.
Yeah, I think on pressure as well. So talking about this from a different sports point of view, and in certain sports, so like baseball, basketball, you can isolate certain moments in the game and know that there would be pressure on the player when they were doing the thing they've got to do. Really classic example of this is free throws in basketball when the score is close and there's under 2 minutes on the clock. So if you're 1 point down and you have 2 free throws, what are the percentage chances of a player making their free throws? And it turns out they're more or less the same as in the first minute of the game when there would be no pressure on that player. What I think, with pressure, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, because it definitely is a thing. Like, all of us will have felt pressure in our jobs or, with our families or playing sport ourselves. Definitely is a thing. And I think we can accurately say that a player did something well under pressure. Ben Stokes played a great innings under pressure at Headingley in 2019. What the data from basketball tells us is that the fact that he did that in the past is not predictive of him being good under pressure in the future. And I think that's the crucial thing that we need to bear in mind with things like pressure. Next question is from Random Cricket Stats. And this is similar to something we asked earlier in the show. So if you want to give a really quick answer, that's fine. But there's a little bit of nuance to it. And I've got maybe an idea. Random Cricket Stats says, are there differences in how you'd approach an IPL auction or a similar structure based on how many years are left before a mega auction?
100%. Because let's say that I was involved with a team in the recent IPL auction, right? I know that there's probably going to be a mega auction in a year's time, because it's the end of the 3-year cycle. So if I know that pretty certainly, I'm doing my best to build a win now team for year one, because there's no point in buying like a load of young players who are prospects on low money, because you won't be able to retain them anyway, because you can only retain 4 players, and you're going to probably retain the guys who are like, your superstars. So the point of buying young players at that point is 1 year left before a mega auction is pretty worthless. However, when you're in a mega auction and you've got to deal with this squad for 3 or more years minimum, that's when you want to look at future proofing things a lot more, and looking at young players or cheaper players who can grow in the environment that you're going to create, and build with the franchise, come with them on the journey. That's when you want to look at younger players and future proofing your franchise. But this is another nuance of the mini versus mega auction dynamic, right? There's so much to consider.
Yeah, I think that covers it. I was going to make exactly the same thing on Win, the exact same point on Win Now. If you know you've got to throw someone back into the pond, as it were, you literally want who'll be best tomorrow. Like, it doesn't matter that they might cost a fortune, and it doesn't matter that they're 33 because you don't have to deal with them when they're 34.
Exactly.
You know, like Suhas on Twitter says, which is the better system? And this is an offbeat question. Which is the better system, draft or auction, for creating a following among people towards a new league?
100% auction.
Okay, what's your reasoning?
All you had to do was see, well, you see it in the IPL every year anyway, but that's, India's a cricket mad country. And so maybe you can't take that in isolation. But all you had to do was see the SA20 auction and how that lit up social media and how the tournament has developed off the back of that very, very quickly, to see that the auction model is just fantastic. It just creates so many talking points.
Yeah, I mean, like it's just for the great headline: X player sells for $3 million or whatever it is. Like that, you're immediately splashing that all over the back page of whichever nation you're in, and so on. Seb says, "How do you and other analysts weigh up availability of overseas players against quality? Do you prioritize players who are not regularly picked for their country?" And sometimes with drafts, international series pop up after they have been announced.
It's one of the hardest things actually to deal with if you're in a kind of draft environment or in a league that's not the IPL. In the IPL, you can, most of the time you're going to get full availability from every player for the tournament. Not always the case, but a lot of the case. In other tournaments, it's tough because you're right. Seb's right in saying that sometimes you might draft a player and then like randomly their country decides to pick them in a series that hadn't been announced by the time you done the draft. There's also other factors to consider which people may not have considered, in that getting an NOC off certain countries who I won't name is much more difficult than others. So actually, the NOC process, on a complete side note, is, I think, one of the biggest talking points that's going to happen in cricket over the next year or two, and it has to change. So I would definitely be wary about signing players from certain countries based on the availability of NOCs, and that affects the player ultimately, right? Because they're not getting picked when they probably merit getting picked on their performances. If I know that an overseas player is fully available, of course that makes them a very useful commodity, but they're still got to be a good player, obviously, and fit into the role that you want them to play. But yeah, you would definitely factor in availability as a major facet for overseas players.
Cool. Toby on LinkedIn asked a question. I think we'll cover this in a bit more detail on the next episode, but he's asked the question. He's given a specific example, so we're gonna get an answer. Obviously, the first round is easy to predict in a draft, but how much of the draft or auction after that do you plan out before? And what happens if someone steals your pick? So answer the second bit there. Say you wanted somebody, you've got fourth pick in a draft. You think it's going to be Ben Stokes, but just humour me here. But Ben Stokes gets picked third. What's the immediate reflex reaction to that from you?
Well, you've got to be pretty calm, I think, after that, because I think it's more of an issue in a draft than it is in an auction, because you've literally got like a minute or two to make a decision very, very quickly, and you can't stall, you can't request a timeout. You might be able to say the technology doesn't work to buy you a little bit more time, but I haven't tried that one. In all seriousness, though. Look, this is what you prep for, right? This is you have depth charts, you have decision trees, whether if someone goes, then our attention turns to this player. This should have all been pretty much planned out in advance. So you shouldn't have to panic. I generally pretty calm in these environments. Happens all the time. You have to get used to it.
Cool. Two more, and then we're going to wrap up this podcast. Salman from LinkedIn again says, how significant a role does data play in auction simulations and strategizing? Is it overlooked in certain cases or not? I'm paraphrasing the last bit there slightly for the interest of time.
Yeah. Look, it depends who you're dealing with. I've worked with coaches who super buy into it, and I've worked with coaches who don't. And so realistically, you've got to pick who you're dealing with, and I think that's a really good learning for people who want to get into analytics. I think we sort of touched on it in one of the earlier episodes, is that make sure you know who you're working with, because that will have a massive implication on what Salman's asking here in terms of how much of a role does data play. Because if you're in a room, people, and you're the only one that believes in data, good luck with getting all your plans through. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. Final one then, Ben from Substack. When assessing players' current form, how do you factor in longer formats, if at all?
Okay, so to give context, in an IPL framework, I did look at stuff like the 50 over domestic comps in India as well. There'll be some form of a weighting that I would give that, and it's especially useful when you've got perhaps a scarcity of T20 data on a young player, for example, but they've played a lot of 50 over games or more 50 over games. Then definitely that's definitely useful. Red Ball less so. I mean, there might be certain transferabilities and skills, but I'd be concerned about putting much weight in Red Bull data in terms of T20 recruitment. There's a reason why Jimmy Anderson doesn't play T20, for example, and the skill set's just completely different.
Cool, Dan. I think that wraps up this episode of Strike Rate, the cricket podcast. Hope you enjoyed it, and join us again. It will be next week now for part 2, or a sister episode to this, where we talk about what actually happens during a draft or an auction, some of the sort of decision trees that you might have to go down. Remember that you can find us on Twitter. I'm at JackHope0 and Dan is at SA Advantage, and that's where we'll tweet out the next topic for the following podcast and where you can ask questions. Dan, any final messages from you?
No, I just want to say thanks to everyone as well for listening and watching. We always welcome your feedback and comments and questions and topic suggestions. So get in touch with us, and make sure you like and subscribe to this as well if you're watching on YouTube. Absolutely.
That actually is the crucial point. The more people that click follow or subscribe on whichever platform you're on, the better, the quicker this grows, the happier we are, the more podcasts we can do. So catch you next week.